Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Hello to everyone. My name is Michael Watts. I work as an economist for the International Labour Organization, which is the specialized UN agency. And I'm going to talk to you today in particular on the impacts that COVID-19 has on labour markets around the world. And I will focus very much in this instance on sort of two aspects, a little bit how the future of labour markets, how the future of work will likely look like over the coming years, and also what is needed in order to have a human-centered approach to the recovery. So a little bit about the International Labour Organization for those who may not have heard of us. We are, as I said before, a specialized agency of the United Nations. As such, we focus in particular on employment issues, on social justice and on labor rights. These are sort of our main focused areas. And one of the sort of more unique features of our organization is that we are what we call a tripartite organization. What that means in practice is that we don't just engage with the governments around the globe, but we have a particular focus also on workers' representatives, such as trade unions, as well as employers' representatives. And we believe firmly that dialogue amongst not just governments, but also trade unions and employers' representatives is a very important aspect throughout this particular crisis. And I will go a little bit more into that towards the end of this presentation. Now, just quickly to the crisis we have at hand, and I'm sure this is no news to you that the impacts of COVID-19 on the world's work is truly devastating. I think today we heard that the number of infected has grown by over 12 million, and we have around 500,000 deaths. And what we can see from our perspective is a lot of those are, in fact, workers who are engaged at the front lines, either as health workers or as first responders, who really work under, at times, horrendous working conditions in order to help others and ensure that we go through this crisis as best as possible. The second big impact we see is, of course, the economic situation we're currently in. So we see that sort of global economic forecast, if you look at the latest figures from the World Bank Group, is that we see an economic contraction by 5.2% in 2020. But we also see that forecasts, also by the World Bank Group, see that we may see a recovery by 2021 of 4.2%, and it is expected for the global economy to recover even further by 2022. However, these are the macro figures, and I would want to sort of engage you on some of the more pertinent aspects if you come across some of these economic figures in newspapers, for example. So things that I am most interested in, for example, is that, how is this impact actually being distributed? Is it equal, or are there those who are most affected? How do groups who are in vulnerable situations actually deal, and how are they affected by the crisis in particular? And I will present you with some of those groups in vulnerable situations throughout this presentation. And next, I think a very important question is to consider that if we see some groups that are more affected by the crisis, are those also the groups that will benefit from the economic recovery we see in 2021? And if this is not the case, what policies do we actually have to be put in place in order for those groups to benefit from any economic recovery we may see in the future? So this is really the core of what I would like to present to you today, is that, yes, we may see a recovery in future, but not everyone is impacted by this crisis, and not everyone will see a full recovery in the near future. And I will go through a few of those groups throughout this presentation. So firstly, I would like to present some of the main figures that we have established throughout the last few months on the impact of COVID-19 on labour markets. So one of the main figures we looked at was working hours lost, in particular because it gives us a much more nuanced look than, let's say, unemployment into what is actually happening for workers around the globe. And what we see is that up to 14% of working hours were lost over the course of the last two quarters in comparison to 2019. And that is an equivalent of 400 million full-time jobs around the world if you assume a 48-hour working week. So these are staggering figures of a loss in economic activity that we are witnessing around the globe. And if you look at the regional distribution of that, you can see two very clear sort of aspects. One is that in the second quarter of 2020, the impact on the economy and on workers has been much greater than in the first quarter, which is to be expected. And the second very interesting thing you see is that you clearly see that it hasn't impacted every region at the same time. So if you look at the first quarter, Asia and the Pacific has actually seen the largest reduction in working time, whereas in the second quarter, we mainly see the impacts in the Americas increasing, given the huge surge in COVID-19 cases over the last few weeks in that particular region. Also, the sectoral impact is very different. So some sectors are much more impacted than others. And we've really established in some of our analysis that these four sectors are actually most impacted. So we talk about manufacturing, wholesale and retail trade, accommodation and food services, and real estate and other business activities. And there are, again, two main aspects to be considered here. One is that they are greatly interlinked through global supply chains. So, for example, any supply or demand side impacts on manufacturing will have huge impacts also on wholesale and retail trade. And the other aspect I would like to convey here is that, in fact, some of these sectors we see most impacted by the crisis were also sectors which had huge labor market deficits even prior to the crisis. So we saw poor working conditions through some manufacturing supply chains in particular, if you look at the garment industry, for example, and also a wholesale and retail trade, we see a lot of incidences of jobs which are low productivity jobs and which are in precarious working arrangements. Another aspect I would like to convey with is that a huge majority of the employers which are actually engaged in those sectors are small and medium-sized enterprises, or in fact they are our own account workers or self-employed. So if you see there for wholesale and retail trade, 45% of the employers in that sector are own account workers. And this has huge impacts for policies, for example, since a lot of the fiscal stimulus packages that we see governments implement across the world are quite slow in actually covering those particular employers. The second aspect, which is very important to consider here, is that a lot of these employers and a lot of workers, in fact, are actually engaged in the informal economy, which means in particular that they are not registered businesses. Workers are not actually do not have official work contracts. And these are workers which are then not eligible, for example, for state support throughout this crisis. And this is a huge issue, as you can see in these figures here, since a lot of those workers are very much dependent on their work as the main income source of income. And we've seen these sort of earnings decrease considerably through the crisis. So informal economy median earnings has increased by almost 2/3 at the world level, and particularly in developing countries, this is setting back those workers who are already the most vulnerable, and we expect poverty levels in particular to increase in future. The next big group I would like to convey here, or the next big vulnerable group, are those of young workers. We know that young workers in general are more impacted by crises around the world. This has been very much the case during the last financial and economic crisis of 2008 and 2009, and this is very much the case here again. And one of the main reasons for that is that young workers are actually predominantly employed in those sectors which are highest impacted by the crisis. Again, if you look at wholesale and resale trade, almost a fifth of all young workers around the globe are actually employed in those sectors. And as I said before, these are mainly jobs which are low productivity, these are minimum wage jobs, and these are also jobs which do not have appropriate contractual arrangements which protects young workers throughout the economic crisis. And there's an additional impact we have to consider here. So we always talk a little bit about young people seeing a double impact from this crisis. We know they have greater employment impact. In fact, ILO youth surveys show that 1 in 6 young people around the world have actually stopped to work. But also another aspect which is very important to consider here is the education impact. So school closures, the closures of apprenticeships programs, of internships programs, has very much prevented young people to educate themselves. And as we know from previous crises, this is one of a reduction in schooling or in years of schooling has a major impact also on the earning capabilities of young workers throughout their careers. Yes, we see that a lot of schools and universities have reacted with online programs, with online tutoring, but this is not really an option for everyone around the globe, particularly in developing countries. The access to technology is not such that this is viable for all countries. So are we talking here about a lockdown generation? Is the scarring effect of this particular crisis of both the employment and the education impact so great that we can see we were more likely to see more long-term impacts for young people in terms of their loss in future earnings, but also in difficulties of entering the labor market, since there just aren't enough jobs out there, and young people might then choose work which does not really correspond to their education level, for example. And lastly, one thing I would really want to highlight is the disproportionate impact that the COVID crisis has on women and women workers around the world. And this is a huge issue that needs to be addressed throughout any policy impact that we would like to see in future. Some of the reasons for that are that women are, again, very much overrepresented in the most affected sectors. So around the globe, 70% of workers in the health sector and social workers are, in fact, women. And we see similar figures for other sectors that are most impacted by the pandemic, such as accommodation and food services, and again, some manufacturing sectors, such as the garment industry. Women are also more disproportionately engaged in part-time work, in informal economy, but also in sort of lower income jobs within the sectors I have just mentioned. Overall, the gender pay caps in those sectors are still very severe. And the fact that they are mostly employed in the informal economy means that women tend to have less access to social security and state support throughout this crisis. Another aspect that is very important to consider here is that women still provide a majority of unpaid care work around the globe. So even prior to the crisis, women provided 75% of unpaid care work. And this is a huge challenge, particularly for women who are engaged in those essential services, such as in the health sector, because additionally, lockdowns of schools has disproportionately affected women in the job. So in order to, this is a very important point to consider, that in order to impact the gender pay gaps, the gender inequalities at the workplace, we very much have to start at the home. There needs to be more equality in terms of unpaid care responsibilities in order to also achieve greater gender equality at work. And lastly, another massive impact of the lockdown in particular is that we see a huge surge in domestic violence cases around the world. According to figures by UN Women, 243 million women already experienced sexual and physical violence in 2019. And there are many cases how the lockdown measures have actually exacerbated the plight of women at home. And this is one of the main concerns that we need to address in future as well. So what does that actually mean for the long-term recovery for all? And I want to come back a little bit to the questions I have posed at the start. Yes, if we want to believe sort of the macro, the aggregate GDP figures, we will see a recovery of GDP by 2021 or 2022. But given the difficult situation that a lot of vulnerable groups are actually in at the moment, we need to put in place a lot more policy that actually protects them. And this is very much a call I have to you, since you are maybe familiar a little bit with the fiscal policies, with some of the measures that your respective countries are aptly implementing. I urge you to check if those policies are actually ensuring that economic stimulus packages are reaching all workers and all employers, including small enterprises, including the self-employed, including workers who do not have a formal contract and are in fact informal and therefore very much dependent on gaining an impact. Do these policies actually ensure that young workers have decent jobs and decent education opportunities throughout the crisis? Or are we again threatened to engage some form of a lockdown generation, which will receive great scarring effects throughout the next few decades? Are the policies gender responsive? Do they actually ensure that we fight gender inequality both at home and at the workplace adequately, so that we can move forward to a more productive society for both men and women? And lastly, I wanted to highlight an impact that not just the economic, we shouldn't just look at the economic and the health policies sort of separately. Our studies have actually shown that countries which have implemented rigorous testing and tracing schemes are those which are currently experiencing the least impact on workers, the least impact on labor markets, given that their lockdown measures may not have to be as strict. So I urge you to also ensure that testing and tracing schemes are not just in place to look after the health of our societies, but they're also the main aspect we need to put in place in order to support our labor markets. So we at the ILO, we are very much committed not just to recover from COVID-19, but we also want to build back better, to build a future which actually looks at the most vulnerable in society and provides policies and provides, at the national level, that ensures that they have a better future to come. And to do so, we have a policy framework in place that looks a little bit into four main pillars. The pillar number one looks at stimulating the economy, because at the end of the day, you need decent work. You need active fiscal policy that promotes jobs through public employment programs, for example, that are geared towards young workers, in particular, in order to provide those decent working conditions for everyone involved. We need to support our enterprises. We need to support our jobs and our incomes, and that goes through providing social protection and social security, such as unemployment benefits, such as paid leave benefits for everyone, not just for those who are in a stable employment relationship. We need to protect our workers. Too many cases we see around the world where personal protective equipment is just inadequate to protect workers around the world. So occupational safety and health measures are one of the key concerns we need to address at the moment. We need to protect women at the workplace as well. Violence and harassment at the workplace has no place at the workplace. And we have even adopted labor laws through Convention 190 on violence and harassment in that regard. And lastly, I would like to leave you with pillar number 4. And I have explained previously that we are unique in the fact that a dialogue among governments, among trade unions, and among employers' organizations are the foundation of everything that we do. So in order to move forward, dialogue, and in particular social dialogue with our trade union leaders and with our employers' organizations, is key to rebuild our societies after COVID. Because at the end of the day, those are the organizations which are most likely to be most aware of the situation for workers and for businesses around the world. And with that, I leave you. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure and an honor to talk to you today, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Just being told that so far there have been no questions coming in, which is of course also a good sign that a lot of the points have been sort of clarified. I will just wait for another minute or two if there may be any further questions at this stage. So at this stage, and also since we are coming to the end of the time frame, I would like to conclude. I would like to thank very much the organizers of the Campus Party to inviting me to this very important event. I thank you very much, the viewers, for having listened to this presentation. If you are interested in our work, and in fact, we are publishing a lot of our work on our website. So if you Google the ILO and COVID, you will find a lot more information on workers in vulnerable situations, a lot more information on labor standards in particular, a lot more information on what we consider the future of work and what we consider the priorities that have to be put in place for us to build back better and for the recovery to be truly people-centered. So at this stage, I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a lot of enjoyment throughout the rest of this event. Thank you very much.